The branch manager turned the laptop screen around so my mother-in-law could see it for herself, and on it was surveillance footage time-stamped 11 weeks earlier, showing her walk into that same building wearing my green wool coat, holding a folder of documents, and signing my name on a hardship withdrawal form while the notary on duty never once asked her for a second form of identification. Carol Whitfield sat perfectly still in that chair, her hands folded on the table the way she folded them every Sunday at church, and for the first time in the 11 years I had known her, she had absolutely nothing to say. My name is Rachel, I'm 44 years old, and I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with my husband Mark and our 2 kids, Sophie and Ben. I've spent the last few months living through something I never thought I'd have to say out loud, and if you're new here, this channel is called Silent Revenge Stories, and it exists for women exactly like me, women who got hurt quietly by the people who were supposed to love them, and who found a way to fight back without ever raising their voice. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I want you to drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because reading those comments is what got me through the hardest weeks of this whole ordeal, and hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next story when it goes up. Mark and I got married 9 years ago in a small ceremony outside Boulder, and from the very beginning, his mother made it clear that she considered herself the true head of our household, even though she lived 40 minutes away in Manitou Springs. Carol had a way of showing up unannounced with grocery bags she hadn't been asked to buy, rearranging my kitchen cabinets while I was at work, and referring to my house as the house Mark bought, even though my name was on the deed right next to his. For years I told myself it was harmless, that she was just a woman who struggled to let go of her only son, and Mark, who loved her deeply and hated conflict even more, always found a soft way to smooth things over rather than draw a hard line. The trouble that changed everything started the spring I had my gallbladder removed. It was a routine surgery, but the recovery knocked me flat for almost a month, and Carol offered to come stay with us to help with the kids and the mail while I healed. Mark thought it was a generous gesture, and honestly, so did I at first, because I was too exhausted to sort through bills and forms myself, and Carol seemed thrilled to finally have a real role in our household. She started bringing in the mail every afternoon and sorting it on the kitchen counter into little piles, and I remember thinking how strange it was that she always seemed to know exactly which envelopes were bank statements before she even opened them. About 6 weeks after I was back on my feet, I logged into my retirement account out of habit one Sunday night, the way I always did to check my balance before paying bills, and the number on the screen made my stomach drop so hard I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. My rollover IRA, the one that held every dollar of my old 401k plus 5 years of steady contributions from my job at a regional engineering firm, showed a balance of $11,000 instead of the $322,000 it should have held. I refreshed the page 3 times, convinced it was some kind of website glitch, before I finally called an $9 fraud line with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The representative I spoke to that night couldn't tell me much beyond confirming that 3 separate withdrawals had been processed over the past 2 months, all under hardship provisions, all authorized by phone and by mailed paperwork bearing what appeared to be my signature. I hung up feeling sick, running through every possible explanation, wondering if someone had hacked my account online, wondering if I had somehow signed something in a haze of post-surgery painkillers that I didn't remember. It wasn't until the next morning, when I called my actual broker, a calm, sharp man named David Chun who had managed my account for 6 years, that the real shape of what happened started to come into focus. David told me something that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. He said the hardship withdrawal forms had come in by mail with a notarized signature, but that 2 of the 3 phone calls verifying the transactions had come from a number he didn't recognize as mine, and that his firm recorded every single verification call for compliance purposes. He offered to pull the recordings and send them to me, and I sat in my car in the parking lot outside his office for 40 minutes that afternoon, listening to a woman's voice on speakerphone, a voice that was doing its absolute best to sound like mine, confirming my date of birth, my mailing address, and authorizing a withdrawal of $110,000 to a bank account I had never heard of in my life. It was Carol's voice. I would have known it anywhere, even distorted through a cheap recorded phone line, because I'd been listening to that voice correct me at every family dinner for 9 straight years. I didn't say a single word to Mark that night, and I didn't say anything to Carol either, because the moment I realized what she'd done, something in me went very still and very calm in a way that surprised even myself. I had grown up watching my own mother lose a small inheritance to a cousin who talked fast and apologized slow, and I had promised myself a long time ago that if anything like that ever touched my own family, I would never handle it with tears and accusations that could be twisted around on me later. I would handle it with paper. The next morning I called an attorney named Susan Callahan, a woman a coworker had recommended years earlier for an unrelated matter, and I told her everything, laying out dates, dollar amounts, and the recording David had already sent over. Susan told me something I've thought about every day since. She said that emotional confrontations get forgotten, but documented evidence gets prosecuted, and that if I truly wanted this handled in a way that protected my family and put a permanent stop to Carol's access to our finances, I needed to build an airtight case before I ever said a word out loud. Over the following weeks I lived a strange double life, smiling across the dinner table at a woman I now knew had stolen $250,000 from me, while quietly working with Susan to pull every piece of documentation that existed. David at the brokerage flagged the account, froze any further activity, and started an internal fraud review that generated its own paper trail independent of anything I asked for. I requested copies of the notarized hardship withdrawal forms from the retirement plan administrator, and the moment I held them side by side with my real signature from our mortgage documents, the differences jumped off the page, the loops in the R too round, the pressure on the Y too heavy, small tells that a stranger might miss, but that a trained eye would catch immediately. Susan referred me to a certified forensic document examiner named Patricia Nguyen, a woman who had spent over 20 years testifying in fraud and estate disputes across the state, and I mailed her copies of both signatures along with a stack of old birthday cards Carol had written to Mark over the years, hoping to give Patricia enough of a natural handwriting sample to compare. It took her 12 days to send back a full written report, and the language in it was clinical and devastating in equal measure, stating with a documented degree of certainty that the signatures on the withdrawal forms were not consistent with my known handwriting, and were instead consistent with characteristics found in the comparison samples provided. While Patricia worked, I quietly pulled bank statements for the account the stolen money had been wired into, something Susan was able to request through the fraud investigation David's firm had already opened. What I found made my hands go cold all over again, because the receiving account wasn't just some random account Carol had opened to hide the money. It belonged to a struggling home renovation business that her brother, my great-uncle-in-law Walter, had started 2 years earlier, a business that had already quietly borrowed money from 2 other relatives on Mark's side of the family, both of whom, I would later learn, had never seen a dime of it repaid. Around this time, I made one careful, deliberate move that I still think was the smartest thing I did through the entire ordeal. I invited Carol over for a Sunday afternoon coffee, the kind of low-stakes visit we'd had 100 times before, and I let the conversation drift naturally toward money, toward how tight things had felt lately, toward how strange it was that my retirement statements looked off. I wasn't trying to trap her exactly, I was trying to see what she'd say when she thought no one was watching closely, and my phone sat on the counter between us recording the entire conversation, something perfectly legal in our state as long as one party to the call consents, and I was very much a party to that conversation. Carol didn't confess outright that afternoon, but she said enough. She mentioned, almost too casually, that Walter's business had finally turned a corner and would be paying everyone back soon, that families were supposed to help each other in hard times, that Mark and I had plenty saved and wouldn't even notice a little help going where it was needed most. She said the word borrowed 3 separate times about money she had never once discussed with me, money that had left my account through forged paperwork and a voice pretending to be mine. It was enough. Combined with the recorded verification calls, the forensic handwriting report, and the wire records tracing every dollar into Walter's business account, I now had a case that would hold up in front of anyone. Right around the time Patricia's report came back, Carol did something that almost knocked my whole plan sideways. She called Mark directly, not me, and told him she was worried about my state of mind since the surgery, suggesting gently that maybe the stress of recovery and the pain medication had left me confused about paperwork I might have signed myself and simply forgotten. It was a quiet, careful move, planting a seed of doubt before I ever got the chance to say a single word, and for about 4 hours that evening, I watched my husband wrestle visibly with 2 impossible loyalties at once. I didn't panic. I simply handed him the recorded verification call again, the one where Carol's own voice confirmed a mailing address she had no legitimate reason to know, and I let him hear it a second time with fresh ears instead of family history clouding his judgment. He apologized before I even asked him to, and from that point on, he never doubted me again, but it taught me that Carol wasn't going to go down without trying to rewrite the story first. The following week brought a twist I genuinely didn't see coming. While Susan was pulling records related to the receiving account tied to Walter's renovation business, her paralegal noticed a second small account folder listed outside Pueblo. A few careful phone calls later, Susan confirmed that Dorothy had loaned Walter's business almost $40,000 2 years earlier under strikingly similar circumstances, paperwork Dorothy barely remembered signing, money she'd quietly assumed was simply gone. Suddenly this wasn't just about me anymore. It was a pattern, one that stretched back years, targeting the family members least likely to notice or fight back, and it changed the entire tone of my conversations with Susan, because now we weren't just talking about restitution, we were talking about protecting people who might not have a broker like David watching their accounts closely enough to catch it in time. I want to pause here and tell you honestly that the hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. The hardest part was sitting across from Mark 2 nights before Thanksgiving, sliding the folder across our kitchen table, and watching my husband read through proof that his own mother had stolen from the woman he'd married. Mark went pale, then quiet, then angry in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before, not loud anger, but the kind of cold, focused anger that comes from finally understanding you've been protecting the wrong person your entire life. He read Patricia's report twice. He listened to the recorded phone call 3 times. And then he looked at me and said the only thing that mattered, that whatever I decided to do next, he was standing with me, completely, no matter what it cost his relationship with his mother. We decided together that the confrontation would happen at Thanksgiving, not out of cruelty, but because it was the one day every branch of the family would already be under one roof, including Walter, including Mark's sister Emily, who I later learned had also loaned Walter $8,000 2 years earlier that she quietly assumed she'd never see again. Susan helped us prepare everything properly beforehand, restitution paperwork drawn up in advance, a clear repayment agreement with real legal teeth, and a plan for exactly what would happen if Carol refused to sign it. Thanksgiving morning came, and I cooked the same turkey and the same green bean casserole I cooked every single year, smiling through a day that felt like walking on a frozen lake I already knew was about to crack. After dinner, once the kids had wandered off to watch a movie in the other room, Mark asked his mother and Walter to stay at the table for a few minutes, and Susan, who had agreed to be present as our attorney rather than as a guest, sat quietly at the far end with a briefcase beside her chair. I laid it out calmly, the way Susan and I had practiced, without raising my voice even once. I told Carol I knew about the $311,000, I told her I had the recorded verification calls. I told her Patricia Nguyen's forensic report was sitting in a folder ready to be filed with the district attorney's office the following Monday morning if this wasn't resolved that day. I watched something behind Carol's eyes finally give way, not remorse exactly, but the specific panic of a person realizing every excuse she'd rehearsed for months no longer had anywhere to land. Walter tried to speak twice and Susan calmly reminded him that anything said in that room could become part of a civil filing, and he went quiet very fast after that. By the end of that evening, Carol had signed a legally binding restitution agreement that Susan had drafted weeks in advance, committing to repay the full $311,000 through a structured plan secured against a rental property she owned outright in Pueblo, with the understanding that any misconduct would trigger an immediate criminal referral for forgery and financial exploitation of an at-risk relative, since Colorado law treats fraud committed against a family member with particular seriousness when it involves retirement or elder protection statutes. She also agreed, without argument, to move out of the guest cottage behind Mark's sister's property where she'd been staying rent-free for 2 years, and to have no unsupervised access to any financial account belonging to me, Mark, or our children going forward. Susan made sure Dorothy's $40,000 was folded into the same restitution agreement that night, secured against the same rental property in Pueblo, so that one quiet widow 2 hours away wouldn't be left holding a loss no one else had ever noticed. Emily, sitting beside me through the whole conversation, finally said out loud what she'd never told anyone, that she'd loaned Walter $8,000 herself and had simply written it off in her head as a bad decision she was too embarrassed to mention. Susan added that amount to the paperwork too, right there at the table, while Carol signed page after page without lifting her eyes to meet anyone's. It's been almost 8 months now since that Thanksgiving, and Carol has made every single payment on time, mostly, I suspect, because Susan structured the agreement so that missing even one payment ends any hope of avoiding formal charges. My retirement account has been fully restored, and the brokerage firm implemented new internal verification steps after David flagged how easily the original fraud slipped through. Mark and his mother speak occasionally, carefully, mostly about logistics, and something in their relationship has permanently changed in a way I know still quietly breaks his heart, even though he's never once told me he regrets standing beside me. Dorothy, for her part, moved to a new assisted living community closer to Emily a few months later, and the last time I visited her, she squeezed my hand and told me she was just grateful someone finally noticed before it happened to her again. What I learned through all of this is that the most powerful thing you can do when someone you trusted betrays you isn't to scream or cry or beg them to explain themselves. It's to go quiet, gather the truth piece by piece, and let the evidence speak in a room where it can no longer be denied. If this story meant something to you, I'd genuinely love to hear the lesson you're walking away with in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, hit subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories so you don't miss what's coming next, because trust me, this isn't the last time someone underestimated a woman with a folder full of proof.